Hey everyone, this is Eric Gardner with the Hey Eric podcast, and we're here with David Garbett, the executive director of O2 Utah, for episode 27 of a recording. And today we wanted to talk about what's been the news right now, obviously, the Great Salt Lake. There's a recent report on January 4th that came out of BYU, emergency measures needed to rescue Great Salt Lake from ongoing collapse. And this was such a big report that a lot of national news outlets even reported on it. So David, why don't you give us a little bit of your background, and then we can dive into this lake.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Great to be back on the program. Like you said, I'm the executive director of O2 Utah. It's a group that I started the very end of 2019. So we're just starting our, headed into our fourth year. Our goal is to try and improve environmental policy, specifically the state's air quality, by getting involved in elections and providing clear policy guidelines for legislators. I think Great Salt Lake is an issue I've been interested in, totally agree, is one of the most important environmental issues in our state right now. Definitely something that needs our time and attention. So happy to be here to talk to you about this.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for coming. So the Great Salt Lake, I guess, origin story, it was Lake Bonneville in the prehistoric time. I don't know whatever happened to that, but we still have the Bonneville Shoreline Trail, and we don't need to go back to the whole origin story. But the big headline, I guess, from the BYU study was that there's 5 years left. If our continued water consumption, if our water consumption continues at the same rate for the next 5 years, it's likely that the Great Salt Lake will dry up.
Yeah, Great Salt Lake, and I think if you're here in Utah, you've seen this, and everybody's now aware that the lake looks much smaller than we all remember, especially if you see some satellite imagery. It shrunk significantly. In fact, it's about 60% smaller in terms of the land area it covers than what it used to be. It's lost almost 3/4 of its volume since its historic levels, basically when Europeans arrived here. Great Salt Lake, unfortunately, is following a trend that we see in a lot of these terminal basins, so basins where you have lakes, streams that don't have an outlet to the ocean. And it's sad. This report lays out why that's happening and some clear both measures about the steps policymakers should take and some more general recommendations about how to reverse that problem.
Okay, awesome. Will you move that mic just away just a little bit? Yeah,
Is that enough?
Yeah, that should be good. Okay, so it lays out things for policymakers. I know last year during the legislative session, there was some bills or a bill passed about spending money to do a study on that. Has that gone somewhere, or did this reignite that? I know a legislative session is starting again. Where did that initial thing go from last year?
Yeah, so I think it's important on what's happened so far in terms of a response to distinguish between the state legislature and our federal delegation. The state legislature has taken some pretty significant steps, and I think they get, and properly so, they should get some recognition and kudos. I can't think of many issues where the legislature, environmental issues, where the legislature has taken so many positive steps that were so significant in one session as they did with the Great Salt Lake. They changed water law to address some of the problems that have led to this decline of the lake. They set aside money, 2 different buckets of money to help deal with problems at the lake. They've taken some positive concrete steps. The authors of the report, and I agree with them, say that there's a lot more that needs to be done, and they need to basically put some more teeth and some more support to get there to save the lake. Federal delegation, I have a hard time being as positive about. I think their approach, oftentimes in politics, one way for a politician to avoid having to do something hard is to say, let's study the problem. And I think that's been the response to the delegation. We know a lot of the reasons why the lake is shrinking. We ought to discuss that here. And I think they've come in and said, like, who knows what's going on here? Let's appropriate some money to study this and see if we can figure out what's going on. We're well past that time. We've got great information. Even with some of the information that is incomplete, like the authors say, if we don't reverse course in 5 years, we could see the lake totally disappear, which would be an absolute disaster. That's not the kind of situation where you can just show up and say, let's conduct our normal study, because then 3 years down the road, you're still at the point where you need those politicians to actually make some hard decisions. This is a way to, I think the federal delegation has been in more of a kick the can down the road kind of response.
Yeah, and this is something urgent enough that you can't. There was a report, I think it was like 5 or 6 months ago, maybe last time we spoke, that talked about like the toxic dust. As it dries up, certain beds dry up even more, and then as the wind kicks up, it can kick up this toxic dust. Do you know much about that? Can you share?
Yeah, so on one hand, we're fortunate because I think how bad it could really get with the Great Salt Lake has not happened yet. We're not really seeing major dust problems from the lake yet, and I'm saying major. But we know what happens because Great Salt Lake is not unique in the sense of what we've talked about of being this terminal lake basin. And there are other places like Owen Lake in California where a lake was dried up and now it's this absolute disaster in terms of the amount of dust that it produces. A lot of our dust storms here this past summer were actually originating down by the Sevier Lake dry lake bed. So we've dealt with this problem a lot in Salt Lake, and it causes breathing problems, leads to unhealthy conditions because of dry lake beds elsewhere. So we've seen that. We kind of know what happens when these lakes dry out. With the Great Salt Lake, the fear is that, one, you'd have this huge source of dust, but two, because it's the terminal lake from all of these mountains that have seen mining, have seen activity, you could have all kinds of toxic trace elements that are left behind in the dust. And once they become airborne, now you're just exposing people to something that they weren't exposed to before. So that could also be a serious health risk. I feel like we should add in, what's the big deal with losing the Great Salt Lake? It's scary for a number of reasons. I think one is the possible health implications. Really problematic dust, for example, in California from a dried out Owen lake bed. We could see that same thing. We could have these toxic minerals. We could have even the dust that isn't particularly toxic still causes problems for the body. Airborne dust is a major contributor to bad air quality here in Salt Lake, and we all know how bad the air can get here. This is one of the issues we have to address, airborne dust. Great Salt Lake is hugely important for migrating birds. There's something, this report, the authors identify about 10 million birds and different species that rely on the Great Salt Lake. Drying out the lake, you've taken one of the most important habitats for birds, other species that depend on them, migration corridor, and eliminated it. There are industries that depend on the Great Salt Lake. Brine shrimp is an obvious one. Maybe a less obvious one is the Great Salt Lake contributes to part of the reason why skiing is so great here. The report authors think that we get 5 to 10% more snow because of evaporation from the lake. So it has these positive effects downstream that I think we don't notice. It also helps to moderate our climate a little bit. There are lots of positive benefits. Losing the lake would be really disastrous.
Yeah, and the way you're framing that, you kind of mentioned like losing the lake is totally a possibility. And that just kind of scares me because it's like, are some of the people like that legislative delegation, are some of them okay with it? Like, and that just kind of just crossed my mind that like, it's definitely a possibility. Like reading the report and hearing it on the news recently didn't quite hit home as much as like, hey, it could be gone literally in 5 years and we have all these problems unless massive action is taken quickly.
I think that's complicated. There are clearly some legislators have done really good work on this. Fortunately, one of the advocates for taking action is the Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson, who I think has been good on this issue. Does every legislator see this as the most important issue they have to deal with this session? My guess is probably no. Is the legislature going to spend more time, for example, cutting taxes, discussing vouchers, dealing with some hot button cultural issues that, may or may not actually, at the end of the day, affect our quality of life at all, even though they might occupy a lot of mental space. This Great Salt Lake issue, will that be as high on their list? My read is no.
Yeah.
And I think that's sad, but the positive thing about that is that's probably the easiest thing to change.
Yeah.
That's where people reaching out to their legislators comes into play, because that's what helps them to change how they prioritize it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like rather than complain about liquor laws, you can call and complain about your water source and where it terminates in the Great Salt Lake. So I guess obviously you hear those campaigns on the radio and news everywhere about, preserving water, taking out grass, park strips of grass, things like that. And it always seems to be on the resident or the homeowner or the citizen to do those things. And there's only you can only shorten a shower so much before you don't actually take a shower. Or maybe you start using one bathtub like we did in the old days, and the whole family goes through for that bathtub. What other ways do we need to reduce water besides just harping on the average citizen to stop using water in their home?
Yeah, I think
there's bigger users.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about where that use is coming from, and first I think. One important thing to talk about here is it use that's causing use of water that's causing the Great Salt Lake to shrink, or is it climate change? Because sometimes you'll hear both environmental advocates and even policymakers say, and sometimes shrug their shoulders and say, climate change is happening. That's why the lake is shrinking. And that's really sad to hear, because what do you do about climate change?
I thought that didn't exist. Sorry.
Well, that's also kind of the surprising thing, because I've heard this from legislators where that was initially, the thought that ran through my head, like, wait, you believe in climate change now? One of the positive things about this is the main reason the lake is shrinking is because we're using too much water.
Yeah.
It's not because of climate change. This area where the Great Salt Lake is located, the temperature over the past century plus has risen. I think the report authors talk about it rising about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So our area is warmer, and there are problems that are associated with that. You do lose some water to the Great Salt Lake because of it. Mm-hmm. But the large majority of this is being lost because we're diverting too much water.
Right.
So we don't have to get the entire world to act to stop climate change from the trajectory that it's on. We don't have to get the whole world to act to figure out ways to bioengineer to lower temperatures, at least in order to save the Great Salt Lake. That's what I think is positive. It's all about how we use water. So does that mean that you and I shouldn't take showers, or that we need to, like you said, have everybody go through the same bath water? No, that's not how we're going to restore the Great Salt Lake. About 9% of the water that flows that's diverted from the Great Salt Lake is diverted for basically cities and industry. And of that, these report authors say that 90% is going to outdoor use.
Outdoor being, is that like
your lawn, your
lawn.
landscaping, So that's if we want to, in our communities, if we want to be better about helping contribute some water to the Great Salt Lake, which I think we should.
Absolutely.
It's all about landscaping. And, I think there are many different ways to improve that. A lot of people could save significant amounts of water, not making a single change to their landscaping, just being more judicious about how they use water, not overwatering, making sure that their sprinklers are running at the appropriate times, that they're not watering the sidewalk. That's really where we're going to make gains in our communities. Your indoor use, in fact, the report authors talk about this, it's essentially irrelevant as we talk about getting water to the Great Salt Lake because it's such a small percentage. That water that you use then goes in a drain, it's treated and released back to the Great Salt Lake. Really kind of an inconsequential piece of the puzzle. So you could still shower, you could still wash your clothes, you could still cook. If you're going to make changes and if we're going to have policy changes in our cities, it really should be focused on landscaping. I think one of the key things we can do, in addition to people just being better about how they use water, considering also landscaping changes, is right now the way we fund water, the water that you would use at your home, only about half of it is paid through your water bill. Most of the rest of it is funded through your property taxes, funded through also through your federal taxes, some other taxes that you pay. What that ends up doing is telling consumers that water is only half as valuable as it really is. And so people use a lot more. And they recommend getting rid of those basically tax subsidies for water use, converting to really a user fee system so people understand how expensive their water is, which I think would be a really positive step in our cities.
Yeah.
Most of the water, this is the part we have to get to, if we're going to get the Great Salt Lake back on track, if we're going to restore it, we have to deal with how agriculture diverts water. 3/4 of the water diverted from the lake is diverted for agricultural uses. Alfalfa, other crops.
Yeah. So here's a question. So has our agricultural water use increased over the last 20 years in Utah? And we might not know that answer off the top.
I don't know the answer to that.
Because I wonder, because we know population growth has occurred, so we know city water has increased, et cetera. But with agricultural, typically as cities grow, agricultural decreases. And so maybe it's that multivariate equation where, while we've had less rainfall, we've had this mega drought in the Southwest, and I'd say we were included in that mega drought. So we've had a decrease in water, precipitation, snowpack, et cetera, and maybe the increase in population, and then either agricultural stayed stagnant or maybe they increased. I'm not sure, but
I don't know the answer on those diversion figures. Maybe some things that tie in part of the reason why has this become so acute.
Yeah.
As of recently, why all of a sudden is the lake disappearing? And I think you hit the nail on the head, is that we've talked about how are we using water, how are we diverting it away, but we have less water flowing to the lake, flowing to all those users now because we're in this period of mega drought. Researchers are saying that essentially the techniques that they can use to look back in the past, they can't find periods where we've had so little water for so long.
Yeah.
Part of their concern in this report is that may be, one way to look at that is like, oh, great, we're already past the deadline for when this cycle should change. We should be getting water soon. This drought will end. Maybe, but there is also some concern that this might be the new norm, and that's part driven by climate change and how that affects weather patterns here. Probably not the most sound public policy to say, well, surely, next year everything will be fine and the lake will get restored just because we're going through this drought.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with the study's authors. You can't just expect that the drought's going to end and this problem will solve itself.
Yeah, be proactive. So when you mentioned alfalfa, so I don't know where I heard this from. Maybe it was you or a different conversation, but a lot of our alfalfa is transported out of state. I've heard that, maybe it was a truck driver. I have a lot of truck driving friends, but a lot of alfalfa is not even used in our state.
I don't know that. I think there are people that have looked at what's the market, where is that alfalfa used. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know, for example, if the alfalfa that's grown with water that would otherwise flow to the Great Salt Lake is the alfalfa that's being transported out of state. I do think, it's an issue where policymakers, and this is probably what is scary to them, the report authors, what's the punchline? They say, in order to save the Great Salt Lake, to prevent it from disappearing in 5 years, we need to get more water to it. And basically, we need to conserve and send to the Great Salt Lake about 30 to 50% of the water that we're diverting right now. That's a pretty serious measure. Agriculture is the biggest place that we're going to find that. And I think the scary thing for policymakers is, that's telling a lot of people they need to do something differently. But not having a Great Salt Lake and the disasters that could ensue, to me, it's pretty clear which direction we have to go. And that's where we have to help policymakers find that courage to stand up and impose some of the solutions that they talk about in here, and really, really decide that it's more important for us to save the Great Salt Lake than it is to grow the maximum amount of alfalfa that we can. One thing that I want to mention that I don't think they talk about extensively in this report is part of the reason we're in this problem is the structure of water law itself. You deal in real estate, and I think most people intuitively and because of experience understand how our legal rules and structure are around land ownership. Mm-hmm. I can go out and buy land. There are not limits on, how much land I can own for most part. There are some limits, some guidelines about how I can use the land. But no one would come to me and say, David, you just bought 18 acres. If you don't build a house in the next year, you forfeit that land.
Yeah.
Water is like that. Water is different than the way we treat land. We've actually specifically structured our water markets not to just allow unfettered ownership, but instead to say to people, we're going to set up a legal market that's intentionally designed to make people use water and to make them, particularly to prize growing crops with that water. We have this, under water law, basically there's a concept of there are permitted uses for water and there are non-permitted uses. And if you don't use your water, basically what they've designed water law for is, think of like at the turn of the century when you've got a bunch of people farming and you didn't want to have some big baron come in or somebody come in and speculate and purchase water and just hold it, when there were people that needed to grow crops, that needed to have farms, that needed to be able to produce food. So we created this structure that's not like land ownership markets, not the way people would typically understand things, that's intentionally designed to get people to use water and specifically to grow crops. And that's part of what has to change.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's like with budgets, in a lot of, companies or governments, like if you don't spend your budget, you might not get that budget back ever again.
Exactly.
Ever again. Because before we started that down, what you just explained, I was thinking, okay, is one way that we can do this is send money to farmers to not plant alfalfa.
Exactly.
Kind of like we do with corn subsidies, et cetera. But the converse of that, I guess, from what you just explained to me, sounds like if we just restructure the way water law is written, then they wouldn't have an incentive to grow. They wouldn't have an incentive to grow that, to waste it, or to use it. Not saying it's wasted, but to use it. And I don't know, maybe it's a combination of both those things.
We're doing some simplistic analogies, but I think that these are key parts, and I think it's really both of those things together. First of all, you have to be able to, you need a legal structure where a farmer could say, hey, I want to help with the Great Salt Lake. I'm happy to lease my water to you for the next 5 years, to let it just flow downstream and make it to the lake. Until the law was changed this last session, he could not have done that. If that farmer had done that, he would lose his water right. Oh. And the report authors talk about this. If you'll just create the legal structure so that then you can follow up and just come in with money and say, who wants to sell me their water right for the next 5 years for, this much money per acre foot. I'll gladly pay money. I think the experience has been, if you create that scenario, if you have some money and you create a legal market where it's okay to do this, they think that we could probably do it at a lower cost and for pretty small amounts of money, be able to go out and purchase that. But you have to, first of all, you have to have that legal backing. Building on that, one of the things they talk about is some of the efforts to save the Great Salt Lake and increase flows. Instead of increasing flows to the lake, they've increased flows to reservoirs before the lake. And that's problematic because if you're filling up a reservoir and you're not then releasing that to the Great Salt Lake, you haven't done anything to save the Great Salt Lake. And that's part of what we've seen in the past. Shockingly to me in this report, our reservoir system and the infrastructure to deliver water is probably wasting through evaporation, leakage, wasting just as much water as we're using in our cities.
Wow. So it's definitely a multifaceted solution. There's got to be a lot of things that need to be changed, restructured. I want to go back to what you said about selling your water back. It almost sounds like you're talking about creating. They have a carbon marketplace for carbon credits within big industry where it's like when they were trying to reduce pollution and things in the air, every company got so many credits or I guess, and then they could exchange those. So if company A, if everyone got 5 credits, company A needed 7, they could buy 2 from company B. And company B, if they had 2 extra, they could sell them.
Yeah.
And not saying that it's going to be that type of free market, but what you just described with the farmer selling their water back to the government to take it straight to the lake is another form of that where it's like, you still get that free market, which obviously in Utah we're so big about, but you allow the farmer the opportunity to like get it back over after a certain term that they agree to. Because I know some farmers. I lived on a farm in Wyoming for a summer, changing irrigation pipe and stuff. And yeah, we were farming all of his land at the time. There was some out in one town where he just put cows on it for a while. But there's a lot of long nights cutting fields. And I really wonder if he wanted to cut all those fields. Like it was a lot of alfalfa, a lot of grain. And it's just like, maybe let one of those fields go for a while. Just put the cows on it and let them do their thing.
Part of the report talks about basically, it's one thing to change the law, but they also need to create trust in that hypothetical farmer you came up with. Like he's 60 years old, 65. All he knows is that like one of the key things he has to do is use water every year, and he's got to use it on all of his fields. Otherwise he will lose it. Like, sure, I get that guy all of a sudden, he reads some vague thing like, hey, now you can just sell this water for 5 years and you don't lose it. He's gonna be a little skeptical. And it's to invest time educating water users that there are now options, ensure that there's money from the state to go out and actually purchase this water, take advantage of these market mechanisms. The authors argue that the end result would be with that in place is that a functioning marketplace where there's trust will likely allow for that kind of conservation kind of cheaper and faster than what we think.
Yeah. Well, I want to go through a few notes and highlights I made in researching for this. So one report I read talked about diking off part of the lake. And I think we've already done that on the north side to some extent. When you look at a satellite image of the Great Salt Lake, there's always these miscolored areas. And I think that's from maybe we diked off that part at one point for whatever reason. Maybe it was for an industry.
The railroad created that.
Yeah.
When they ran the railroad across the lake.
So, yeah, I actually rode my motorcycle on that in 2020. But they do have, they have those one sections where water can flow, but obviously it can't free flow easy enough, right? Yeah, that was the Lucerne cutoff.
Yeah, and they disagree with that idea. I'm with them on this one. Like, basically, let's just sacrifice that northern arm and say, forget about it. It's already the salinity levels are too high. But then you're really, like, at that point, you've said, we're not going to save the lake. Let's offer this huge sacrifice zone and have all of those problems we've talked about: toxic dust, lack of species, or you've eliminated habitat for species. You've eliminated any potential for brine shrimp, brine flies, which is what the foundation of so much of the Great Salt Lake is premised on. So that you're just kind of giving up on that part of the Great Salt Lake.
Yeah, and one of the externalities from that is as this happens, as we decrease the size or as it goes down, we lose additional evaporation, which then prevents future rain. So it's kind of like that spiraling circle where it's like if we do one thing that's not the right solution, then it affects future, production of rain, which then decreases the lake even more. So from what I've learned so far through this research, it's like so much of it just needs to be we need to divert it back to the lake, pick reservoir levels that make sense and get the rest of it to the lake, incentivize farmers, big ag to send it to the lake. Actually, you mentioned Sevier Lake. Is that how you say it? Mm-hmm. I actually did a motorcycle ride down there. We went right past it like 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. And my friend, he tried to ride on it. Mm-hmm. He still sunk a little bit. It was a pretty soft lake bed. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that when you look at Sevier Lake on Google Maps or wherever, it still looks like a lake on there. It's blue, but it's just a big empty bowl, big dust bowl.
It is now. Yeah.
Yeah. But one thing that we need to talk. So let's touch base on this snowpack this year. So I think obviously when a report like this comes out, it would have hit harder had we had a December like we did last year, a year ago. Mm-hmm. With current snow levels and precipitation, like I bet you there's a lot of people who want to dismiss this report saying, look outside. Alta has the most snow, I think, in North America, for ski resorts at least. Brighton is... we have 4 resorts, I think, in the top 10 for snowpack for snow so far. So, how much does that? We have, I think, 106% of annual snowpack as of yesterday.
106.
160.
Oh, 160.
And obviously, this year is way different than last year because last year we had a great November. Then December and January were pretty bad. December was horrible. And it's going to take. I bring this up just to say, the snow is great, but we can't just depend on the snow to solve the problem, I guess is where I'm going.
Yeah, and this is, I think maybe the best analogy I've heard on that is restoring the Great Salt Lake as a marathon. And, just because we're at mile 2 and in this moment we're feeling really good, that doesn't mean that you're going to feel good in mile 3 or 4, and you've got a long ways to go. You've got 20 plus miles still to go in that marathon. In practice, just if this winter, and let's hope it continues, that's awesome. No downside in getting a great precip year. That's a great thing. This year alone, even if it continues this incredible trajectory, is probably not going to be enough to, in one fell swoop, save the Great Salt Lake. That would take a real miracle. And because we're in such a deficit, this water, one thing the report authors talk about are all of the underground aquifers that have been drawn down. And so a lot of this water can go towards that. When the soil's really dry, a lot of this can just be sucked up by the soil, and you won't even necessarily see it in the Great Salt Lake. And then the other thing we've talked about, reservoirs, like if we have this great runoff and all of a sudden we decide we're going to fill Jordanelle and we're going to fill Deer Creek, but below those reservoirs, basically flow hasn't changed at all. Well, we didn't do anything for the Great Salt Lake then.
Yeah.
We prevented some of the key water sources from continuing onto the lake to help it.
Yeah. Well, the article I read researching this, it mentioned we would need 3 more winters like this one for our reservoirs to get back to normal.
Yeah, that's just the reservoir.
That's
It's not
just
the
the
Great Salt
reservoirs,
Lake,
yeah.
right?
So we, 3 more with 160% plus snowpack to get reservoirs back to normal.
Wow.
Yeah, and so obviously no one miracle is going to fix this, no matter how much we pray. But it just shows that, just got to let it flow downstream. Got to find that multivariate solution that makes sense for all stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
What do you obviously we live in Utah, but with all this precipitation we've been getting, California's been getting it also. And
Hammered.
if you hear about them in the news, my friend actually lives in the Central Coast. I'm forgetting now. And I actually reached out to her yesterday and spoke to her today. They left their house because they're getting so much rain.
Wow.
They haven't had power for 5 days. They live right. I totally am blanking, but I texted her because I heard on the radio talking about mudslides, too much rain, reservoirs are full. Now they don't know what to do. Do you have any comment on that?
I mean, it's tragedy, and having lived in California in a year where they had kind of super dry and then out of nowhere super heavy rains, it's part of the reason why they have these problems. Unfortunate.
Yeah, I guess it's does a lot of this come back to that whole climate change where it's like things are changing for the overall patterns of storm systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the research is pretty solid on this, that climate change is impacting weather generally. They were seeing these increased incidences of abnormal storms, so you have much wider swings. I think it becomes this unhelpful political dialogue where people say, well, you can't say that this one storm was because of climate change. And it's like, sure. But, based on the best science, based on analysis, we can say with confidence that storms are, we're seeing more variability. We're seeing these storms, these wider fluctuations and swings. So, in terms of like the probability that climate affected that, you're almost always fairly confident that the storm was worse, or it was an incidence that happened more frequently or will happen more frequently because of climate change.
Yeah. So one last kind of pop question I just thought of is we've obviously some of the biggest reservoirs, Lake Powell, right? Mm-hmm. Lake Powell's a huge thing in Utah, right? Everyone goes down there every summer. Mm-hmm. I've only driven by it. I've never actually been in Lake Powell. But, Lake Powell's huge. Glen Canyon, people say it was prettier than the Grand Canyon before it was filled. And it was a deal that environmentalists had to make with the devil, choosing between that and I don't know if it was the Grand Canyon or somewhere else. But one article I read a while ago said we could drain Lake Powell and we still wouldn't refill all of Lake Mead. Yeah. And we're getting twice as much evaporation because the lakes cover so much area. Mm-hmm. I guess, what do you think? Is there a compromise or a solution that we need to introduce there? Like, obviously, the outdoor enthusiasts at Lake Powell, the boaters aren't going to be stoked on that. But if we're losing twice as much evaporation because we're not stacking water, I don't know. I know one of them, I think it was Lake Powell, it's low enough that it's almost not going to produce electricity.
Yeah, Lake Powell, I mean, if you're not aware, like you said, it's been shrinking. Forecasts are actually that the lake will effectively, I'll say disappear, and by that, drop below a level where they're able to take the water out of the reservoir, so below the spillways.
Wow.
If trends continue, and now maybe this year, we'll push that off a little bit, but the last forecast I saw on this was by October this coming year.
Oh, wow.
It could drop below that level. I think if anything, to me, Lake Powell is emblematic of a lot of the political problems and dealing with issues like this. Lake Powell fundamentally was built to meet a legal contract. It was an agreement between states Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico about how much water they would deliver every year to Arizona, to Nevada, to California. And I mean, if you step back, that's kind of funny. Like you're saying, here's a free-flowing river that nobody determines how much water it contains in a given year.
Yeah.
And these states were guaranteeing a certain amount to lower basin states. And that's just kind of an absurd proposition from the get-go. And that's the whole reason the reservoir was built. It wasn't built to get water to people. Secondary benefit was that it produces power.
Yeah.
But that was the reason it was built. Still not effectively, it's not a source of water for anyone. It meets that contract sometimes now, and it produces some electricity. But, the writing is pretty clear. Colorado River Basin does not have the water that it used to have. There's some hard choices that are coming. Having Powell and having Lake Mead, if this drought continues, I mean, there's just no way you can have both reservoirs, and Powell's the one that's going to have to go.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty obvious the agreement should have been states need to ration the water and they each get a share, but there's no state like Utah has any business guaranteeing a certain flow to a state like Nevada or California.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen political leadership from Utah on this at all. In fact, it's a very much, an even worse head in the sand approach where there's still discussions about building a pipeline from Lake Powell to produce water for new development in St. George. And, I think Mitt Romney almost flirted with this idea of telling people like, hey, nope, this is not a dependable source of water and we're not going to invest federal money in future development in St. George. So, yeah, I think it's just emblematic of some structural political problems and, the lack of leadership and the lack of willingness from state leaders to say things like that to Washington County. No, we are not pursuing a pipeline. Look, let's be real here. Lake Powell, if we're lucky, and I use that term loosely, I guess if we're lucky, unlucky, will be around in 5 years. Probably, if you're betting, it's not going to be.
Yeah. Well, bad news for Washington County. No more growth there. Shouldn't have grown so big.
I mean, even Washington County, it's hard to feel too sorry for them. An interesting thing with Washington County, with their growth, is that about 20 years ago, they probably were kind of using the same amount of water as Las Vegas on a per-person basis. And Las Vegas was in this mindset of, we will go anywhere, we will run over anyone, we don't care, we will get water. And I don't know if people remember when they were trying to get water from the Snake Valley, which is central western part of the state. And Utah fought them on that. And ranchers, rural residents in Nevada said, no, we're not going to contribute. And at that junction, Las Vegas basically said, okay, we're going to focus on conservation. We're just going to use less water. They have made huge strides, like shocking to me, the strides they've made. In that time period, St. George has done nothing. They've done absolutely nothing to address that.
They've grown. And I think the mindset, because Vegas knows what they're dependent on, tourism. St. George, I heard a report yesterday, the day before, their median home price now they're mostly second homes, obviously, 1.2 million. Was an average home price there. That blew my mind. And guess what people with $1.2 million homes like? Grass.
Yeah, and in St. George, I don't even think, look, at some point there probably should be a limit on, just saying this is all the water that's available. But I don't think we're anywhere near the point where people in St. George have to say, my kids can't live in this community. We can't have some level of growth. We can't have people down here. Like we talked about here on the Wasatch Front, 90% of our water is going to what we do outdoors. St. George is really not showing any serious commitment to being better on that front. And Las Vegas shows plainly you can change that trajectory. You can support a relatively large population on a small amount of water. And we just don't see that behavior. They're still stuck in kind of a 1960s, 1970s mentality of like, We're going to get the federal government to come in and subsidize some huge projects so that we can do more development. We won't really pay for it. The bill will be stuck on federal taxpayers, and, great.
Yeah, well, hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully they change, because I like St. George.
Yeah, great spot.
Yeah, great spot. Just don't need grass there. It's too hot.
Yeah.
But all right, David, that's, thanks for coming and talking about all this with me. Obviously, it's big in the news, and as a listener, as a watcher of this, reach out to your state representative, your federal representative. It's the best way to get involved in politics and to change things. The more annoying phone calls and emails they get from people like us, the more they'll change. Typically, the people who contact their legislator are people with passion, and usually it's people on the other side of the conversation sometimes. I hate to say it.
I mean, two things on that. One, we talked about this at the beginning, but in my mind, the uncertainty isn't, I kind of laughed at the federal delegation showing up and saying, like, what we need are studies. We don't need studies. We need action. We have the information. If you're listening to this and you're confused about what needs to happen on the Great Salt Lake, that's okay. What we need this to be a priority for lawmakers. We need them to be thinking like, I've heard from a lot of my residents, this probably needs to be more important to me than some random culture war bill. This needs to be more important to me than, some of the other things that I'm putting that can be taken care of at other times or just frankly aren't as big of issues. Hearing from constituents is what will change the priority for legislators on this. And that's the most important thing we need. They just need to hear from people. And there's actually, I'd say on that, good research showing that legislators don't tend to hear from an actual representative cross sample of constituents. And frankly, especially with our delegation, with our legislature, it's probably biased towards their hearing from people who are calling about culture war issues, some of the more salient issues for right-wing media, frankly, and not even saying that in a derogatory way, but they're going to hear a large number of comments in that space based on really good research on this field.
Yeah, well, so yeah, if you need help finding your legislator, you can hit me up. I'll post it below and wherever these comments end up. David, where can people reach you if they have more questions or want to get involved in what you do?
To learn about us, o2utah.org. Again, the letter O and 2, just like an oxygen molecule, o2utah.org. We're on the socials too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for joining to listen to this and get educated on what's happening in Utah, because while I do real estate, I love Utah, and I tell everyone to move to Colorado because I want to keep Utah small and weird, and the Los Angeles is too full already. All right. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks, Eric.